Welcome everyone to this this event today, which we're very pleased to have so many of you with us, and also very pleased to be part of both the New York Climate Week and the Net Zero Festival. A really relevant topic for both, of course. I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Sarah Lugers. I'm the Director of Communications at the Gold Standard Foundation. And just a quick introduction for those who don't know us. The Gold Standard's based in Geneva, Switzerland. What you see captured here on the slide is about, the figures that you see are capturing primarily our legacy work. We were created to ensure environmental integrity and sustainable development in the carbon markets. And that remains a core part of our business and will be relevant to the discussion today. But what you also see is that our work is quickly expanding into these three scopes that you see here: environmental markets, which I've mentioned, but also into corporate climate action and reporting, as well as sustainable finance. And what we're seeing already is that while we have started looking at those sectors independently, you'll see already in today's discussion that those lines quickly start to blur when we look about different ways to maximize climate action for sustainable development and the highest impact. So the topic of the conversation today is about beyond net zero. But recently we've heard net zero is the gold standard, if I may. Isn't that what we should be aiming for? But I think what we're seeing already is that there isn't just one net zero. While it's been defined in the IPCC report, and there's a lot more clarity now from the Science Based Targets Initiative that defines what net zero means technically, just making a commitment isn't quite good enough. There are important points to be made about what is done in the interim, what kind of timescales are involved, what mechanisms are used and when. And that's really what we're here to unpack today, to define what is good net zero and what should be done in those tricky areas beyond scopes 1 and 2, which are a little bit easier for a lot of companies to get their heads wrapped around today. I think what we want to acknowledge is that while there are some examples of greenwashing around net zero, when you have targets 50 years in the future and nothing to commit to in the interim, in some cases companies are just really being bold and making that commitment so they can send a clear message to their stakeholders, to their teams, of what they're expected to deliver. But some of the tools and resources and guidance aren't yet there to solve all sorts of problems that are required to reach net zero in the scale that we need. So again, we have great experts here with us today to unpack all of that. You'll hear from our Chief Technical Officer, Owen Hewlett, who will kind of set the stage for what we're talking about when we're thinking about beyond net zero and what these ambitious climate strategies look like. Then we'll talk about the very tricky but huge opportunity of Scope 3, and we'll hear there from Sandra Yannet from SustainCERT, as well as Alyssa Foster from Patagonia, who are knee-deep in these issues. Then we'll look at kind of beyond the value chain and where these instruments start to blend. We'll hear there from Brad Schallert from WWF, and we had a late switch from EDF. So we're fortunate we have Pedro Barata here today, replacing Kelly Kazier from EDF. And then we'll have a discussion with all of you. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Owen Hewlett, who will kick us off in setting the stage. Owen.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see so many friendly faces from some of the initiatives that I'm involved in, like the Value Change Initiative and our carbon markets work. I'm going to talk just very briefly to sort of set the scene a little bit in terms of how we, and I think our key civil society allies are starting to think about how do we correctly frame, credibly frame corporate action, corporate practices, and corporate claims. And we have an almost unprecedented opportunity to do that now with so many other changes coming about and a kind of to some extent, you could call it shoegazing, I guess, into, what should we all be doing and what should we all be saying about it. But I actually think that this is a kind of once in a generation opportunity to try and put the building blocks in the right order. And on the screen there, this is in our DNA at Gold Standard. And one of the reasons that we were founded originally is to not just think about credit level integrity in our carbon markets work, but also think about how that instrument, if you like, whether it was at the time CDM credits or voluntary markets, so much discussed recently, fits into the mitigation hierarchy, is used correctly, if you like. And the mitigation hierarchy, if you don't know sort of 101 stuff, it goes back a long time. It's been part of the kind of classical academia on this topic, and it posits that a robust, credible climate strategy for a corporate actor, or any actor actually, should be to avoid emissions, reduce emissions, and what I would say, take responsibility for residual emissions in that order of priority. So avoid, don't travel anymore, reduce, switch from flying to trains, and taking responsibility. Well, my train travel still has residual emissions. What can I do about that? How can I take some responsibility for that? And as old as that is, it still stands. There's nothing there that is different now to when it was first posited. Clumsy analogy I like to use is that it's sort of like reduce, reuse, recycle in waste management, in that what we don't want is for recycling to take priority over reduce and reuse, as often happened in the waste management cycle. Nothing wrong with recycling; it's a good idea, but not if it's persuading us, if you like, to stop to not reduce our waste. And it's the same with things like carbon offsetting. As a mechanism, it can add value. It ceases to add value when it becomes a priority over avoid and reduce abatement. And what's changed, I think, in recent times, not just the Paris Agreement, but is that we've moved to a place of non-arbitrary avoid and reduce target setting. We never had that under Kyoto. And you may remember in the Kyoto eras, Kyoto watchers, the countries that had targets at that time, they were political, legal constructs rather than meaningful science-based constructs. And corporate targets were similarly arbitrary. I'm being a bit sweeping there, and I'm sure that's not universally true, but a lot of corporate targets were, as far as we can before we need to buy carbon credits to deal with the residual. But as far as we can, won't avert the climate emergency. It has to now be science-based if we're going to avoid climate breakdown. And so, enter stage left, science-based targets back in Paris, shifts the needle immensely by making that avoid and reduce part non-arbitrary, science-based. And that, of course, then means that the take responsibility part doesn't need to be arbitrary anymore either. It should remove the bad smell of, actually, it's too hard to avoid and reduce, and I'll go so far, and then it's cheaper for me to offset. And one of the challenges with carbon markets is that it has never had a price point that moves the needle. And so we move from this kind of non-arbitrary to arbitrary, starting to make sense of the different mechanisms that are available to companies in this mitigation hierarchy. And if we go on to the next slide, Sarah, and Brad will talk in much more detail of this. This is an excerpt from WWF's corporate blueprint. We move from non-arbitrary generally to an organization with the credibility and legitimacy of WWF to be able to say, this then is what we think companies should do, as opposed to don't do that, or don't do this, or that's a bad claim, that's greenwashing. So we move from this slightly difficult position where civil society has struggled to say, we would get behind you if you act like this, because that arbitrariness makes it difficult. So to me, the blueprint is the landmark event. It's the first time that I can recall holistically that a major actor has sat down and said, this is what we do want you to do. And it's brave in that sense, because when you do say what you want, you have to be right about that, right? Like you really need to know that you said the right thing, because companies will start doing it. So really brave and really impressive. I think it moves us away from a world where, excuse me, individual tools like carbon offsetting or individual claims like carbon neutral or net zero end up sort of de facto determining the corporate behavior and filling in the blanks. That's backwards, right? What the blueprint does is says a credible company in the climate breakdown era could be acting like this. and puts things in the right order. And then we can build where these milestones fit, where these tools like voluntary carbon markets fit. How do we deal with scope 3? How do we make sure scope 3 doesn't trip up carbon markets and vice versa? How do we make sure the whole thing doesn't trip up the Paris Agreement? So I really like this non-arbitrary era. I really like this more holistic era. The missing kind of piece of the puzzle, which we want to move on to next, of course, is to say, provide more technical guidance for the blueprint, to support the blueprint and to support science-based targets. See also what Sandra will talk about in VCI terms, but also how can we wed this to compelling brand equity driving claims that are credible. So, carbon neutral, as I say, grew up from common practice, isn't necessarily something that many people really endorse from a technical or moral standpoint. It kind of grew up just because it grew up. We have an opportunity here with this more holistic, non-arbitrary take on corporate practice to say, if you did all of this, then you have the credibility of civil society behind you, and you could call yourself X. What that X is to be determined. And maybe that X is, I think climate positive was the term used in science-based targets consultation. Let's take that as a working title. Then how does that apply to a company? How does it apply to a company's products and events? I think becomes a really interesting conversation. So we shift from what's compelling, how do we make the behaviors and practices and actions fit, to what are the practices and actions? How can we then add those up into a compelling, credible brand equity driving claim? And then, we don't need to rely on an unloved phrase like carbon neutral. We can start to get behind something that we all feel comfortable with, and we know will add value, and is something consumers both trust and want to get behind. That's the end goal here, in my view. So kudos to WWF for doing it. We at Gold Standard are intending to build further on this. We'll obviously engage with our partners and allies at WWF and science-based targets on it, but to develop more technical guidance to support it, to start to develop the claims guidance that goes with it, which I think ultimately will unpick the big questions of which action fits in what bucket and how can I talk about it credibly, because I realize that all of the sustainability managers in the room will be, well, this is a morass of stuff, this is a whole wave of stuff that I could be doing. How does it all fit together? I think we're maybe 1 to 2 steps away from it all coming together in a cohesive vision. I think what WWF have done is provide us with that actions platform, and then adding to that, then the claims to go with it will be in a really powerful position. So I feel really optimistic for the future of both clarity and ambition of corporate action. I'm aware that many people in the room come from initiatives like VCI, where you hear all the time from me, and in return, I hear that all of you want to do your fair share, to take responsibility, and I really think that's starting to come together now. So I'm excited to hear what the others have to say.
Thanks so much, Owen. It's a perfect overview to start digging into this latter half of the mitigation blueprint in some of the most complex areas, which is scope 3 activities. And for that, we have an excellent group of panelists that I will advance the slide for here. To set the stage for what Owen has alluded to, the value change initiative, which Gold Standard is also supporting, and how that fits into scope 3 solutions for a leading organization like Patagonia, and how it nests in their broader strategy. So over to you, Sandra.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for that introduction as well. I think you framed up front that this webinar we are focusing on going beyond boundaries, and I'm about to go right back to within the boundaries. So really look at box 2 in the blueprint that Owen just mentioned. And this is because scope 3 emissions are one of the most complex areas to tackle for many companies. On the one hand, they often represent the largest percent of emissions in a footprint, yet there's the least direct ability to control them. And looking at all these challenges through a scope 3 lens first does make sense, because it really will be one of the main levers for climate actions. And given its comprehensive and overlapping nature, it also touches all the levers, incentives, mechanisms, policies, and frameworks that we will be talking about today. And companies are facing all of this as well. So facing many questions on how to navigate different accounting protocols, incentives, and market mechanisms, what can be claimed where, and a general lack of guidance. I like to call the Scope 3 Wild West, but a lack of clarity on how to clearly and credibly have impact recognized and accounted towards climate targets. So all of this is why we created the Value Change Initiative. So seeing that the why is pretty clear already for climate action. Sorry, if you can just flip back one. Yeah, I think the science-based target initiatives and now the net zero standard, as well as the WWF blueprint, really do help to define what companies need to do, but the how is also very challenging, and particularly when looking at value chain emissions. So for the last 3 years, Gold Standard, together with SustainCERT, where I myself work for, we've been bringing together key civil society organizations, experts, and leading companies, and really looking to find ways to collectively innovate and define best practice. And by now really forming a consortium of ambitious, committed organizations that together are effectively writing a playbook for positive change. So organizations looking to reduce their emissions in line with 1.5 degree pathways and work towards their net zero ambition. And if you go to next slide there now, I think we've been doing this since 2017. By now we've engaged more than 60 organizations under various work streams. And there we really move through different stages. So we're working on guidance development and in programs. We get corporate feedback in sector-specific working groups. We're even testing verification and certification of impacts that are realized through various pilots already. And here, programs are really focused on creating further guidance on how to account, allocate, and transfer emission reductions amongst value chain partners and towards Scope 3 footprints and targets, and looking at key Scope 3 categories in that respect. So we've started with purchased goods and services, but are also looking to extend towards use of products sold, transport, as well as investments going forward. Now, the working groups that we've been running really take a sector lens to all of that. So provide both applicability and feedback on applicability, but it also really has created a place where we are identifying challenges that go beyond the scope of the guidance documents that we're working on and beyond the scope of Scope 3. And even beyond net zero. By nature of the partners we've been working on, we've been really looking at the applications in agricultural value chains first, together with food and beverage companies, agri-traders and suppliers, as well as looking at material supply chains of apparel companies. So this includes Patagonia, who is on the line and we'll hear from next. And this has also been really a place where we've started to learn, define, and work towards solutions together beyond Scope 3 and really leverage climate action at scale. But first, just on the next slide, I wanted to highlight the first official output of these efforts. And with that, I think touch on some of the beyond boundary challenges we are looking at as well. So the first output is a value change guidance document that focuses on purchased goods and services. And what this does high level is really explain how to include only the known changes in emissions that have resulted from projects that are being implemented in supply chains or direct investments that are being made to implement activities that reduce a company's Scope 3 footprint. And to do this in line with greenhouse gas protocol reporting and extension have clarity on if and how impacts count towards a Scope 3 science-based targets. or by extension belong under a net zero commitment or even a commitment to finance beyond. So this guidance, really focusing on the within part, gives clarity in 3 parts. So the first part is really about how do you account for a project or an activity that you've realized, which we call an intervention, as a whole. So how do you do the quantification? What is eligible to be included? How do you set boundaries? And all of this is not very new. We're leaning on a lot of experience in the carbon markets here, but still worthwhile guidance for companies that are looking to take the first steps and set up projects themselves. But the second part is really where new concepts and solutions come in, because this part is about how to then align those emission reductions achieved in projects back to your corporate footprint. By extension, also clarity on what cannot be aligned back to footprint. So the third part talks about the claims language that you can use to communicate about about those impacts that really are beyond the scope of a corporate footprint. So just reiterating that, but saying it a bit more sequentially. This accounting approach really that's offered in the guidance is really complementary to the way emissions from purchased goods and services are already calculated in the GHG Protocol Scope 3 standard. So really taking the volume of goods you purchase and multiplying it by the emission factor. So what this guidance then does is effectively allow for creating a new or improved emission factor. But doing that with only knowing the known changes that you caused with your projects or investments. It also offers some useful concepts that didn't exist before that can allow you to make claims, even if it's not possible to establish full traceability, for example, in material supply chains. So a good example there is you might know very well what your project is realizing, and you might know that the project sits in your supply chain, but you might not know if the exact cocoa bean or coffee bean from that supplier actually is the one you're purchasing. So these are some of the challenges that we've tried to resolve with the guidance, and therefore we've also clarified by developing this guidance is that you can only make claims towards your Scope 3 targets to the extent that you can are purchasing an amount of commodity impacted. So all of this points to that even if you set up a project, maybe not all of it belongs to your footprint. And recognizing that could create a disincentive for action. There's a part in this guidance that already talks about how to communicate about the remaining parts that you're not claiming in your footprint, but as well as sort of putting a big placeholder on the role of removals. I'll let the other panelists jump in on that. What is really at the heart of this guidance is what can and cannot be included for Scope 3 reporting. And by setting those red lines, we effectively also had a clear call to action to provide more guidance and ensuring there's incentives for going beyond your boundaries. And this is really where the net zero standard and WWS blueprint are starting to offer some more concrete pathways. So some of the challenges that have come up in all these work streams are sort of technical and accounting in nature, but it's worth highlighting also some other recognition challenges, not just about going beyond your boundaries, but also questions around recognizing existing or emerging protocols, data collection tools, methodological approaches. All of giving more clarity and guidance on this will remove barriers to action. And there's also implementation challenges. So the nature of Scope 3 means that there's a need, but also an opportunity to address Scope 3 emissions collectively. But that right away raises a lot of questions on how do you allocate impacts to collaborating partners, to investors, to value chain participants, and ultimately, how do you make sure that those who invest have a right to claim impacts that are achieved, that there's no double claiming, that there's, or at least no problematic double claiming, and also to ensure that there's no that the interaction between other mechanisms doesn't actually lead to unintended consequences, or even worse, displacement of action or climate financing. So bringing together effectively all the mechanisms, frameworks, enablers, and organizations that can help support scope 3 actions. The Value Change Initiative is trying to find a way forward and really provide more clarity on the how to and incentivize action and skill. So on that, Sarah, I'll pause here. I think it's over to Alyssa.
Yeah, Alyssa, it would be terrific to understand how Patagonia looks at its climate change ambition overall, and how what we've discussed so far, particularly in scope 3, how you're looking at those challenges and opportunities.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, and Sandra, thanks for that overview. I feel like you did a great job summarizing all of this work that we've been doing. I'm gonna just start with our starting place at Patagonia, which, as many of you have heard the saying, you can't mitigate what you don't measure. So really starting off with measuring our carbon inventory was where we started, and we have our baseline year at 2017. Doing that allowed us to really see where our impacts are, and about 86% of our carbon emissions come from manufacturing the materials used in our products. So with that information, we could then drill in to identify hotspots and see where there are opportunities to reduce impact. We had for a while been really focused on utilizing recycled materials and renewable materials, and that's a huge initiative for Patagonia. We've been working on it for most of the time Patagonia has been a company, but in earnest since 2015. And what we've learned is that we can reduce impacts only so much by switching our materials from a virgin material to a recycled material. We have moved about 75% of the materials that we use to recycled materials, and about 87% of Patagonia's materials are what we consider preferred. So all of these are environmentally friendly fabrics and materials that have a lower carbon footprint, and that's part of our strategy for reducing that 86% of emissions that are coming from our scope 3. With that information, we really wanted to know what the potential impact reduction would be by changing everything we possibly could to a preferred material, and also looking at another component of material manufacturing that we have control over, which is how materials are dyed and finished. And with that, we learned that we can reduce our carbon emissions by about 15% from what we'd call a counterfactual. And that counterfactual is basically business as usual if we didn't change any of this material. So it gives you all a sense of like, that's important. That's a significant 15%. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort on our part, but we're still making we're still making product. We're still using resources. We're still using energy to manufacture the fiber, the yarn, using energy to weave or knit the fabric, do any dyeing and finishing that's needed. And so with that, we know that we also need to do other things to reduce our carbon emissions. Just switching materials isn't going to get us to net zero or anywhere close to it, to be honest. And so there are a couple other components that we've been looking at within our business to reduce emissions. Those include growing our worn wear program. Our worn wear program is a used clothing sales platform where we are selling used Patagonia gear that we've gotten back from customers to new customers. And we've long put a lot of effort into making our products really durable and timeless. And so it's a program that fits our brand really well. And by selling used, you can, in theory, displace the need to sell new. And that new product, again, is the product that has that large carbon emission linked to it. So that's a big part of our efforts going forward to reduce emissions. And then the last piece is really working with our supply chain partners. And so each step in the garment manufacturing process includes a supply chain partner. And all of those steps require energy and some sort of fuel use to power the processes. And so we've been communicating with our supply chains to understand where they're at and see if they are using any sort of renewable energy already, and if they have energy efficiency programs in place, and then really working with them to start those conversations if they haven't been working on those things to date. We have identified that weaving and dyeing and finishing are really significant carbon emission steps in our supply chain. So those are areas that we're particularly focused on. So again, back to that initial carbon measurement, we were able to see those hotspots, which allows us to focus in on the areas that are going to make the biggest difference in terms of reducing carbon. And I will say too, like, I know this is on carbon, but we've been finding a lot of links to water as well. So where there is high carbon, there's often high water use, and water is a super important resource in terms of manufacturing textiles and garments, and obviously super important to the various regions where we make products, so important to keep an eye on water use as well. I do want to mention a few of the challenges that we have seen in addressing Scope 3. We think that, you know, there's a ton of opportunity to work with the supply chain and to start those conversations. And we know there are so many sophisticated businesses and partners out there that are those manufacturers in the supply chain. So I think there's a ton of potential there. Challenges for a company like Patagonia include the fact that we are, you know, fairly large at this point and have a lot of different supply chain partners. So it will take a lot of work to work with them all to start making those reductions. And we don't have a ton of control over their businesses and their energy use and decisions around that. Also, renewable energy is really important to this equation, and there are varying policies in different countries that we manufacture product in, and so it's not a consistent playing field in terms of incorporating renewable energy. And then, to the point of this conversation today, tracking the interventions it has proven to be something that we need to figure out, and so that's why Patagonia joined the Value Change Initiative back in early 2020 to really work with our peers in the industry to figure out how we can have a standard way of accounting for these interventions, these carbon reduction projects that are happening. We want to do it the way everyone else does it. We want everyone else to do it the way we do it. And so we are really pleased that these value chain initiatives have been in place so that we can have alignment in the industry and we're all tracking the same way. We think that there's probably a very happy medium between having it so rigorous that it's almost impossible to account for and track, but also having it rigorous enough that we know it's reflecting truth and we're not double counting and we're reflecting our emissions reductions accurately. Because when it comes down to it, what we really want to see is emissions reductions. We don't want to account for things that aren't actually happening. We want to make sure that these reductions are happening and we're tracking them. And I think that's what we're all trying to get at here, is how can we actually reduce emissions and how can we actually report and track and show that that's the progress that's being made. And so initiatives like this are really going to help us take steps in that direction. And I know there are a lot of other brands that are in this spot right now too, where they've measured their carbon footprint years and years ago. They looked at it, they identified the hotspots, they knew they wanted to make improvements, and here they are making improvements and now wanting to track those improvements. So I think we're at a really exciting place in this journey now, where there are great stories to be shared and great initiatives that have actually been reducing impact. So.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alyssa. I love that you talked about the kind of collective action and the way peers are coming together pre-competitively to solve the problems, because everyone knows that one company going at it on their own is not going to move the needle, especially in something like Scope 3. And I also noted you mentioned like what is the right level of rigor, and I think that'll tee up a discussion that we have a bit later on claims and how the beyond value chain kind of activities, the future of carbon markets is also instructive, because that's a place where you're issuing a carbon credit where you have to have that level of rigor to the ton of CO2. But is that necessary in every case where, when we're reporting, what's good enough so that we don't have such transaction costs that it makes it not worthwhile in the first place? So really useful points. I would ask, so this begs the question, I think, Sandra, maybe for you. A lot of people have talked about this historically as insetting. How does this relate to insetting? What has this process revealed about that term and that ambition, I guess?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Great question. I think that the quick answer to that is probably that everyone has a different definition of insetting, including some of these value chain intervention approaches that we're talking about here today. And I think also good to sort of look back at why we started this work, and especially out of a carbon market standard, because it started with a group of companies who had already set really ambitious Scope 3 targets, and then we're running into questions of, okay, if I purchase a carbon credit, does that count? The answer to that is clearly no, but back then it wasn't clear yet. If I set up a project that is in any way related to my supply chain, it's lowering my Scope 3 footprint, right? And we found out here that no, there's nuance to that. So if, for example, you're setting up a project in your supply chain, let's say with farmers that are producing your commodities, right? So you're intervening directly, and part of that project is offering farmers cook stoves. So there's a lot of companies looking at these types of projects, and there are a lot of assumptions under the word insetting that then also lowers your Scope 3 footprint. But what we found out through these working groups and in developing this guidance is what is key is, does it affect the production of your goods and services? So the same project, the cook stove project, if it's being implemented by a purchaser who, let's say, and these are some actual examples in areas where they are growing shea nuts, and shea nut farmers are using the cook stove to boil the shea nut as part of the production, then those reductions count, right, towards your Scope 3 footprint. If the same cook stoves are then given to a farmer and they're using it to reduce their consumption of wood for household purposes, then it's beyond the corporate Scope 3 footprint. And I actually, just to extend that towards why do all these interacting definitions, terms, and mechanisms create confusion, there's also some real life examples that I've seen of companies investing directly in a cook stove producer to produce and disseminate cook stoves in their supplier communities, but the same producer also issuing carbon credits off the same cook stove, right? And this is where you start to see problems. Companies with the best intentions making investments with the purpose of lowering their Scope 3 footprint under the term of insetting, right? But actually, we could all look at each other in 2030 and said, oh, we thought this was counting towards our target, towards our claim, and it's being used in various places and circumstances. So back to your question, is this insetting? It depends on what the definition is. We're quite intentional to specify what are Scope 3 interventions and what actually falls beyond those boundaries.
I'll take that a step further, Sandra, and say that insetting doesn't exist. It's in boundary, or it's not, or it's addressed by that scope, the supply shed concept that is probably more technical than we need to get into today for this conversation. Alyssa, maybe back to you, acknowledging that you've talked about, the great lengths you've gone to get good data, engage suppliers, and indeed join the value change initiative to sort out some of the remaining complexities. You're obviously pretty advanced in your journey. What, a lot of companies are just getting started and looking to make bold claims and, not sure how to to start on the path. Do you have any kind of advice for those organizations?
I definitely recommend measuring your carbon footprint and understanding, at least in general, where your hotspots are and also what your company's tools are for reducing carbon. I think that's a really nice place to start. I think having that knowledge will at least give you a sense for what your potential is for reducing carbon. And then the ambitiousness of the goals that you want to set are up to you and your brand. But I think it's nice to know at least a path that you're going on and create that plan. I think by doing those measurements and identifying those hotspots, you can build a plan, and the plan should come first and then the goal, so that you're really understanding what you're working towards and how you're going to work towards it. And so I would really recommend folks, to have a lot of insight into what your business does and where the emissions are coming from in order to set a really authentic goal to your brand. Every brand has different potential, has different challenges, has different dreams for their future and how they're going to contribute to the climate crisis. I think everyone's goals should be authentic to what they're working towards. And so I guess step one, measure. Step two, look at all your levers for how you can reduce emissions, create a plan, and then create a goal that's authentic to your brand.
Great, thanks. So we'll come back. Scope 3 will remain a conversation in the next session we have here, because I mentioned already that the lines blur. Sandra has spoken to this already. But as we look at on the journey to net zero, how can companies take accountability for their unabated emissions, carbon credits, and what has historically been, referred to only as carbon offsetting, has been a way to do that. We're entering a new era where claims that we've talked about already start to become different, and some of the rules need to adjust to the new era. So it's important that we look at the most credible instruments as we get into, as companies look at as a tool towards their targets. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brad Shallard from WWF.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Gold Standard for the invitation to be here today. So I'm going to talk about three different topics here very quickly, just touching on each of them very briefly, because we could spend all of our time on one of these topics. So I'm just going to reflect some of the latest thinking that WWF has on the role of carbon credits in corporate climate mitigation strategies, how to select high integrity credits, a project we have going with Environmental Defense Fund and OCO Institute, and then a little bit on just how we're thinking about the credibility of claims. So so that's what I'm going to dive into here. Just starting out here, zooming out to 50,000 foot view, if we think about the different ways that companies can take responsibility for their emissions, we're starting to categorize these into two different batches of ways, right? So one is like a compensatory approach. So this is traditional offsetting, right? You have your remaining emissions, and then you buy carbon credits to net out those remaining emissions. You could also, Owen was talking earlier about the evolution and sort of mainstreaming of the science-based targets concept, right? Where first, before you go to offsetting or buying whatever outside of your value chain, you look at how you set really ambitious emissions reduction targets for your operations and your value chain and start working on that. So it turns out to be a different approach fundamentally, but the thing that it has in common is this: you're compensating, right? So carbon neutral, carbon negative, those are claims where there's a compensation aspect, right? But there's been this emergence of this climate contribution approach, which is embedded within the WWF BCG blueprint, which I'll talk about it a bit more, and Owen referred to earlier. There's others out there that are talking about this, like New Climate Institute. They have their climate responsibility approach. I think, the claim climate positive, I put that here as potentially being seen as a compensatory claim, or a climate contribution claim. There's different takes on this right now. Anyway, we won't go into the detail of like all of these headline claims, because they can get very controversial and there's misinterpretation of like what they are, I think, sometimes. And I'll talk a little bit about that, how we might, as a discourse, kind of move towards more of a standardized version of these claims. So I'm going to jump into talking about the blueprint. So there are 4 different steps of the blueprint. 1 and 2, account and disclose your emissions. 2, set and start to work toward achieving your science-based target. Steps 3 and 4 is where we sort of shift away from the traditional offsetting approach. Step 3 is your calculating your financial commitment that you would spend outside of your value chain, and potentially inside too, right, to go beyond your science-based target. So you multiply your remaining emissions by a given carbon price, and that gives you some money that you can spend in these different ways in box 4. And we think of the whole approach as needing to be holistic too, so you can see how we have alongside and throughout. You should be also looking to influence climate policy, collaborate with other stakeholders, and then have efforts that is building resilience for your company and for the world in a changing climate. But really, the core of the blueprint are these steps 1 through 4. I'll go into a little bit of detail on how this might be achieved, and looking at sort of a longer term trajectory of a company here as an example. So the emissions going up here, that would be sort of BAU, right? The darker gray trajectory, starting in 2020 and going down, is what you could say a long-term science-based target trajectory. The blueprint, where we do see this as syncing with the science-based targets net zero standard, which will be published in late October. But we see the blueprint especially as being useful right now for action, right? So if you're looking at this time period of, let's say, 2020 to 2025, you can see how a company could spend the funding that they generate from multiplying their remaining emissions by a carbon price and spending it in these ways. And this is just an example of how a company might do it, right? A company could spend $25 million on getting further emissions reductions, thus overachieving their science-based target for their value chain emissions. They could invest in unlocking climate solutions. So this is sort of a more general category of things that might not necessarily be carbon credits, right? They might be investments in R&D. They might be investments in unlocking enabling conditions in different landscapes, so you can get a longer term mitigation out of them. So an example I tend to use is supporting land tenure in different countries. So you have those that sort of ability to get emissions reductions over a longer period of time. And then of course, C here is carbon credits. You could use the voluntary carbon market infrastructure and invest in carbon credits too. So when we first launched this in 2020, we pushed it out, and then over the last few months, there has been one company that has adopted it, Klarna, with their Give One campaign. So we're starting to see some uptake here, and this red line should not be crossing out strategy. It should be underlining WWF and BCG blueprint. There's a little bit of a formatting issue there, but we are starting to see uptake. We think that there will be uptake from more organizations. Some discussions are being had. So yeah, we really hope this gets taken up. We know it's a newer concept, and there's not necessarily a specific claim associated with it. So we recognize that that's a potential barrier. Owen also mentioned. Actually, yeah, let me skip ahead here. Owen also mentioned earlier, what is the right carbon price you're going to use to multiply your remaining emissions by? This is something we don't answer in the blueprint, but it's in our plans to look into this in a little bit more detail. There's several schools of thought on this right now. within the discourse. Maybe it's using the social cost of carbon, and multiplying your remaining emissions by that. It might change by the regional context, right? In Europe versus the US versus other countries. You could actually look at different types of emissions and multiply them by different costs of carbon, right? So you can see how it can get kind of complicated, and we're looking into how to provide best guidance to companies about which carbon price to use. I'm going to go back here to talk a little bit more about the benefits of this climate contribution approach, which is embedded in the blueprint. We think that this, as opposed to a compensatory approach or traditional offsetting approach, will lessen the burden to do these following things. So to prove that a project is permanent, to prove additionality, to demonstrate that there's an outcome that has been achieved by the carbon credit, right? And even, it lessens the burden to avoid double claiming with the Paris Agreement. So I say this lessens the burden because these things are still important, right? Lessens the burden in terms of the communication that the company is providing. When you say you're carbon neutral, you are signaling to consumers that the project has permanence, right? That what you're buying to address these remaining emissions is additional. I think it would be great if a company would use the blueprint and then also buy carbon credits. They're extremely additional, permanent, et cetera, right? That's sort of the icing on the cake. But from the perspective of the claim that's being communicated, this contribution approach, we think, allows companies to be more accurate, authentic, and credible, and just honest about what's happening here, right? Because it is really difficult to prove, put that in quotes, to prove additionality, to prove permanence, even though the thinking within the carbon market and the tools that we have to ensure permanence and additionality have really improved over time. So I'm going to move on to talking about the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, which is a project we have with EDF and OCO Institute. There's a Climate Week event on the 24th where we're going to go into a lot more detail about how what we're doing in this project and the methodology that we've been developing and that sort of thing. But I'm going to give you a very quick overview right now. We'd love for you to join on the 24th. I can put a link to that event in the comments later. So this project, we started it, I think almost 2 years ago now, and maybe even before. There was some initial thinking to do this, and it was sort of looking at the voluntary carbon market and looking at CORSIA, the ICAO CORSIA, the aviation carbon market coming online. We thought we really need an independent assessment of the market and not just depend on the CORSIA standard and the carbon crediting programs to ensure quality. So we've been working on this for a while. We have identified the criteria for carbon credit quality in the first phase. Over the last several months, we've developed almost 122-page or 120-page methodology that's applying these criteria and assessing carbon credits. And right now we're doing a demo of the methodology and are building out the website that would host the scores of these demo applications. And so to talk a little bit about how the methodology works, first we start with the criteria. There are 7 quality objectives that we're assessing against. Within those quality objectives, there are different criteria, such as additionality. That roll up among these quality objectives. The way that we're scoring this is, with a score of 1 to 5, and we're scoring each of the criteria. And the way that it works is we score each of the criteria. So for additionality here, I know it's really hard to see, but this says additionality in the first column here. And then that score will be added to the quality objective score. And then you take the quality objective score and you add it to the full results here. So it sort of, cascades upward, I guess. And what we hope is that, this will, we'll be able to get scores and we'll be able to put them into a user interface on the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative website. So companies can come here and other stakeholders can come here and sort of see, if they pick a certain carbon crediting program, a project type in a country, what that gives them in terms of the results. So we hope it's a nice starting point for companies when they start to do their due diligence, when they want an independent view of the quality in the market. And very lastly, I'll talk about claims. A very meaty topic. I feel like whenever I'm talking with someone that is not deep into the carbon market discourse, it always comes to, well, is it okay to claim carbon neutrality, right? That's what they really want to know. And it's very complicated. So this is just sort of the framework that we're using internally within WWF to think about how to get to credible claims. And first, there's certain what we call headline claims. This is like net zero, carbon neutral, that sort of thing. They're catchy terms, right? It's sort of what the marketing team is going to mostly care about within companies. We also think it's super important to have narrative claims. Like, this is where companies can actually explain what's happening, right? It's not just this headline, it will undoubtedly always be a little bit ambiguous, right? So narrative claims are really important to back up whatever headline claim you have. We should also think about the difference between process and supporting action claims and performance claims. So this is, the difference here is like you're doing something, you're in the process of doing something versus you have achieved something. There's sometimes a case where companies will say, I'm a net zero company, but they haven't actually achieved net zero, or I'm carbon neutral, but you haven't actually done that yet. So this is something to think about, or companies should think about when they're communicating. And we have come up internally with this. It's unpublished, but I'm sharing with you right now the consensus within WWF. This is what we think the principles for claim credibility are for the corporate climate strategies. I've seen sort of similar principles from other organizations popping up recently, including the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, and this set of principles was a input into their process. So I think that a lot of initiatives are coming up with the same sort of claims, and these will be based off of the ICEAL credibility principles. But I think one of the reasons why it has been difficult for not just WWF but other organizations to come up with a claims framework is there's kind of differing perspectives on claims and how important credibility is versus the attractiveness and sort of motivational potential of the claim. So this is just reflecting, some of the views that we've had in WWF and within WWF, and I think this is representative of others in the space too. So there are some that really focus on the credibility aspect, right? That this is extremely important and the most important aspect. There's others that have a completely opposite view and say claims are really only important in terms of allowing companies to take the actions we want them to take. So, I'll give a general example, right? If a CEO wants to say carbon neutral and not climate responsibility or climate positive, and the alternative is to not take action, climate neutral or carbon neutral, like that's what's going to get the action within the company. So, it's interesting because that might not necessarily be seen by others out in the public as credible, but the decision might still be taken like we're going to go with carbon neutral, right? So I just wanted to kind of show how I think that these two goals are kind of at odds with each other. So it'd be really interesting, if Gold Standard or others move forward with a claims framework to help companies understand what's appropriate to say. So thanks very much. Over to you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Brad. It is a tricky balance to strike, and we do look forward to encouraging those narrative claims because they're appropriate in some contexts, particularly when people start to dig into the details, those who really want to know what's behind it. We saw PayPal do that just this week, who talked about their approach to their climate strategy, and you didn't see any buzzwords or any headline claims, although we do want to respect that can be a motivator, and we want people to be able to trust it. So it'll be a big challenge for us to strike that balance. Pedro, can I ask you to share a bit about, first of all, the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, how that organization that is kind of running parallel to the task force for scaling the carbon market, how they're looking at these issues, where the tensions might, run up against one another. Maybe we'll start there and then move into the discussion around how the mechanisms around Scope 3 and carbon markets actually are starting to come into practice, particularly in the U.S. context.
Thank you, Sarah. And first of all, let me say I'm learning a lot just by sitting here and listening to the previous speakers. I'm definitely not an expert on. Well, I'm an expert on carbon accounting and certainly on carbon credits, but not on so much on the corporate side. Let me just say, just to put everybody in the picture of who I am, if you want. I'm currently with EDF. I'm working in the climate team as a senior director. I'm also in the expert advisory group of the Science Based Targets Initiative. And as of yesterday, actually, as you mentioned, or as referred to, I'm co-chair of the expert panel on the governance body to follow the TSVCM. We still don't have a particular name for it. And finally, I'm a colleague of Brad in the team that is undertaking this carbon credit quality initiative. So basically, my background is in carbon offsetting. As to your point about the relationship between VCMI and TSVCM, well, the way I would see it right now is we have a plethora of, and this is on a personal level, we have a plethora of initiatives on the voluntary carbon market right now. The TSVCM is one. To an extent, the net zero standard itself has some relation to the voluntary carbon market, and so it's important that we try to integrate these initiatives so that they provide a single message and a coherent message to companies in this space. So companies that want to take on a net zero target, that they can actually have coherent guidance across all of these. So I'm not going to tell you much about the VCMI itself and its components. What I will say is we're very much at the beginning of what the TSVCM is doing. And what we're going to be solely focused on is really the supply quality. So to a large extent, the issues that the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative that Brad mentioned, those will be, to a large extent, the issues that we as expert panel in the TSVCM will be looking at. And the hope is that we do a good enough work, put it this way, that it will resonate with let's say, the demand side considerations and the claims considerations made by VCMI, and that together these can, if you want, complement the excellent work that SBTI has been doing on the net zero standard. I think the worst outcome would be to have disjointed outcomes or even contradictory outcomes, because right now I think there's a real need for some clear guidance across all of these to different companies. So I hope that kind of answers your question, and I can then move on to the issue of avoided emissions versus removals, and then finish with the Scope 3.
Perfect.
So let me first of all say again, I'm relatively I'm relatively old in the carbon market space for sure, with 25 years of experience, but only recently been working on this issue of both the claims and the carbon neutrality component, so within the scope of the Paris, but it's post-Paris corporate environment, if you want. And one of the things that I think is, I would say, is leaving me a little bit, let's say, uncomfortable, if you want, is this notion that that there is some, let's say, prioritization to be made right now in 2021 for companies doing offsetting, put it this way, a prioritization of removals over avoided emissions. And if I cast back 10 years ago, and I'm thinking in terms of quality. I've had the experience of serving on the CDM executive board, where we had a little bit of removals and a lot of avoided emissions projects. And what I can safely say is that there is no direct relation in terms of the quality of supply between a project being a removal project or being a reduction project. And to put it in very blunt terms, there are equally good and equally crappy projects, whether you're talking about removals or reductions. So what I think is happening here is that we're doing what economists call, and I was an economist by training some 30 years ago, calls the fallacy of composition, i.e. to think that what is good for the overall economy applies equally to a family or an individual agent. So coming back to this point, it is clear that we as a global community need to go to a space where we only have, if at all, when we get to net zero, we only have removals. That's clear. But we cannot take the inference that from that reality, from that principle, which is clear, that backcasting to 2021, that we should be telling companies that you should prioritize removals over reductions right now. And I think that's a key point that I would make. Then that begets the question, then what happens in the meantime? So from 2021 to wherever, 2050, etc., what should then companies do? And I think that's where it gets tricky. I think, first of all, what should motivate companies is in wherever they're searching for units outside of their units to compensate their emissions. What should motivate them is the quality of what they're doing in terms of additionality, in particular, in terms of a lot of other criteria that Brad has gone through. So that would be my very first point. Then moving on to scope 3, I think scope 3 is where a lot of, let's say, relevant carbon market action can happen. But it has to be done within very clear guidance. And one of the things that I find interesting is, first of all, let's recognize that there are a lot of companies for which scope 3 emissions are enormous compared to their scope 1 or scope 2. And so a net zero commitment that would only have scope 1 or scope 2 or selected trivial parts of their scope 3 footprint covered would be meaningless. So I think that's clear. We need to have scope 3 covered to the most extent possible. The challenge there, of course, is lack of control over these scope 3 emissions. And that's where I think we have to challenge companies, whether that is in effect a lack of control, and whether that's by, let's say, if you want, a self-definition of control that suits them in their particular case. Because actually by stating that you have no control, you're also in my view at least, you're not looking at alternatives in your actual value chain. So just to say that I think is still an area where offsetting, compensating, contribution in the nature of offsetting is relevant and can take a deeper role. But I think we need a lot more guidance and deeper guidance on how to monitor and account for Scope 3 emissions. And I think the Value Chain Initiative in that respect is doing quite a tremendous work. I'll leave it there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe just reflecting a bit on some of the comments that I've seen come through, and we'll address more directly in a moment. But I think we definitely see a role and a need for the taking full responsibility for unabated emissions. The question is how to do that most effectively with what instruments. So I think the voluntary carbon market can really evolve to meet some of that, but not be the only instrument to do so. So that's just a general comment. Thanks very much. I've seen that Kelly Kizier has been able to join us. So Kelly, I believe you've been able to hear what Pedro has said so far. So I'm working on allowing your camera and your microphone. If you'd like to add anything in particular now before we start taking questions from the floor, please feel free to do so. Or maybe I will grab a comment. There you go.
No, I mostly wanted to give my apologies for double booking myself this morning.
We're glad you could join us.
You were in good, and let's be honest, better hands with Pedro anyway. But, you know, Sarah, I just want to the only thing I'll end with is doubling down on just what you said. I think, you know, from our perspective, this is all a yes and, right? Not a no but. So a voluntary carbon market cannot resolve climate change. And we can't expect it to, and we can't allow anyone to act as if it will. But we can carve out a useful space for it, and that's the balance that we have to find, right? Carbon markets in general can't be a, you know, sort of get out of jail free card. We need to see decarbonization consistent with the path to net zero. To the extent that this can contribute to really much needed investment, it's amazing. But it'll never take the place of all the other action that also needs to happen.
Hear, hear. Thanks, Kelly. So we'll keep you up on the panel if you don't mind for some of the questions coming through. And to the participants, please feel free to share them through the chat, which many of you are thankfully already doing. We have a question that's talking a bit more about the carbon pricing, which is part of the guidance of the corporate blueprint. The comment is, I agree with everything that's been said. Why can't we talk about a proper 1.5 degree carbon price integrated into your balance sheet and showing all your suppliers what the actual cost is? I don't know if anyone has a perfect answer for that at this stage, but I open it to the panelists who might want to reply to that. And if not, I'll pick on Owen since he's my teammate.
I mean, sure, happy to say a few words, but I think Pedro and Brad would have an interesting view here. I mean, I think the reality is we likely can do that. I think there's some steps to be taken first to provide that clarity of how all the various forms of accounting and various forms of actions and claims fit together. But ultimately, what's in that blueprint is for scope 1 and 2 anyway, a 1.5 degree aligned target. I think scope 3 SBTI is still well below 2. Brad may know better than I do, actually. And then couple that with the setting of a price. And I think it's the setting of the price that will be the art. So, you know, there's a temptation to say, let's set it to the social cost of carbon, but then it ends up, you know, $250, $300 a ton, and that becomes a barrier to action rather than an incentive. So I think finding the right way to price such that it's credible, it incentivizes action, and that it sort of is is meaningful in driving you to take more abatement action within your boundary, as opposed to seeing it as the soft option, as Kelly just said. I think that will be key, and I quite like the idea of ratcheting that over time in a sort of kindred spirit to the ratcheting mechanisms in the Paris Agreement. Maybe there's a corporate ratcheting to be done as well, as we all try and take our fair share. But yeah, Brad,
Thanks.
interesting view. Yep.
Yeah, Brad.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. This is what we're in some way struggling with, right? I think that overall we would want a company to go as far as they can, right? And I think that the way that, Michael, you're talking about reflecting that price is an interesting way to do that, right? You're sort of passing that cost on to, as the way that you do business to others, right? That you're working with. So, I guess there's different ways to implement it, and then there's different sort of ambition levels too, right? And my guess is that it won't be a one size fits all approach, and that we're not going to just be able to say it's $100 a ton for everyone or whatever, right? Because there's a lot of different types of businesses, and I think that we want to make this, a process or something that can be done by a lot of different companies. But I think we still need to see some sort of we need to create transparency. I think that maybe that's an approach here, so we could all see which companies are what they're taking in terms of a carbon price, and Owen was saying, maybe there's a ratchet that happens over time. I think that's probably the direction we'll have to go, given the inability for us to just say it's $100 a ton or whatever, right? So.
And not just a shadow price, but a real price.
Yeah.
I would add in terms of transparency. Pedro, do you want to comment very quickly? Because I do want to move to other questions as well. Did you have something to add?
Very quickly, yes, Brad mentioned transparency, which I think is critical. We're not at a stage where we can have any standard say, here's the carbon pricing methodology that you want to do to set this pricing target. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you want to have a balance between pricing that is based on marginal damage cost, i.e. the damage to the site, so it's social cost of carbon, and pricing that is actually done through marginal abatement cost. And in between, there's perhaps a sweet spot that is relevant for companies in this context.
And we would add to that, we're also looking at the value created by that positive impact to make sure that that's acknowledged. So maybe moving to a theme I've seen in the comments around historic emissions. What do panelists think about companies kind of cleaning up historical damage? How should companies think about that? Should they think about it? Does that raise any issues? Yeah. Brad, I see you want to, I know you want to answer this one.
Oh, I could, yeah. I mean, I wasn't raising my hand, but I have a view. I mean, I think that like carbon negative claims or, I guess it's historical lifetime carbon neutral or historical neutrality, something like that. I think I've seen companies use. And I think it's a good thing. It increases the ambition of what you're doing outside your value chain, right? I think it is, helpful. It probably for companies helpful as a narrative too, right? And whether you have to use removals or not to clean up those emissions. Like I know that conceptually it's like, well, we have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, right? But like Pedro was saying, I think that the investments, right? You should be first looking at quality, right? So if there's not enough reforestation projects out there, to not buy bad ones, or to invest up front in creating new ones that will be good, right? As opposed to just buying what's on the secondary market right now, because and it worries me, the headlong rush to removals, because it is inflating the prices of removals in the market. Like there's some good reduction projects that are being left behind because everyone feels like they need to plant trees, and we're really worried about that, right? And we hope that the message just keeps getting out there that should be focusing on quality first, and it's irrespective of whether those are removals or avoidance or reduction credits. So.
Thanks, Brad. There's a question around, or a point made around, there's an additional consideration for credibility, acknowledging where the company's impact is. For instance, their emissions might be small from a footprint perspective, but their output, particularly when they have advisory services, for example, might be massive. So is there, I would add to professional services and advising, I would add the finance sector. Which of course, if they're properly looking at a scope 3, would it capture that? But is there any comments from the panel on how companies, given their different business models, might think about their climate strategy in that context? Kelly, I see your hand up. I don't know if it was for a previous comment, so I'll pick on you first.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do that annoying thing where I answer your question, but totally in a different way.
Perfect.
I'm sorry. I do think scope 3 emissions are wildly important, especially for companies where we see their biggest impact being in their scope 3. So I think including that and finding a way to tackle it is hugely important. One thing I will say about company impact that we don't talk about enough is the impact they can have on policy. So we are not going to reach a global net zero voluntarily. We're going to have to see more and more comprehensive regulation. And one of the most powerful roles that companies can play is supporting that policy, which will also help with some of the pricing. And I think we should be looking at how supportive companies are on policy, as well as how they're addressing their own internal decarbonization across all 3 scopes.
That's a really important point, and I think why it underscores the corporate climate blueprint. I think Influence Map is doing good work here. There's probably more to be done so that you don't have the right hand doing one thing and the left hand undermining any kind of positive action that's being marketed. I see lots of hands up on the panel. Sandra, we haven't heard from you, so would you like to chime in there?
Yeah, I just want to build on what Kelly said, and really that biggest impact being in scope 3, and tie that back to your question, Sarah, because I sort of see, even in this initiative, sort of a shift of companies who are perhaps more consumer facing, and were the first to commit to targets, and now really seeing a big group of companies that are perhaps further upstream in value chains, but have a huge opportunity to enable financing towards projects. Because it also ties to their propositions and provides a business opportunity. And this is where I think we're starting to hit speed and scale, and especially now starting to see the first financial institutions pop up in that regard, and really looking to enable financing and scale, not to lower their own scope 3 footprints, although I'm sure they appreciate doing that too, but really because they can have a role to accelerate financing towards these kind of interventions, and see that again as a proposition that they can offer to their clients.
Thanks, Sandra. Pedro, did you want to add anything on that point? No. You might be on mute, Pedro. Apologies.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, because I think that's such an important point that Sandra just made. Like, in order to do that, we also have to create incentives. So we've seen this huge interest in net zero goals. And to some extent, that's why we're having all these conversations about what can be claimed and how is net zero achieved. I think we, as a community, need to strive to create other benchmarks. And that's why I like this exercise, because we can create goals that aren't so much about what can be accounted here and what can be accounted in this box, goals related to that investment that companies can also get some benefit from. And I think that's a challenge to us all, and something we really need to do.
I would totally agree with that, Kelly. It's been frustrating, I think, in the past to see companies that could be doing nothing at all taking action. In some cases it was carbon offsetting because that was a mechanism that was easily available to them, and being criticized for doing something instead of nothing. So I think you're right. We need to kind of level set the claims and make sure that people have opportunities to take action now as they set a longer term, more ambitious strategy. I think it's really important and gets back to some of the points that Alyssa shared earlier. Is there any, I think that one thing that I see a lot of confusion around is when we talk about the, so maybe ending here since we have only a couple of minutes, when we're talking about the voluntary carbon market and moving from offsetting claims to alternative claims that might have, the benefits that Brad outlined, are these financial claims? Are they contribution claims, impact claims? Are there any thoughts? Owen, do you have any ideas on this? I'm turning around to you as the communications person and asking the question on this. But how do you think we can provide that kind of journey that Kelly just talked about and make them, desirable and compelling while still credible?
Yeah, and you know me, if you leave it to me, I'll give it a terrible acronym. So careful what you wish for. I think the way we're thinking about it at GS is that you have impact claims and then compensatory impact claims developed further from that. And a compensatory impact claim has variable attributes that it means it's permanent and it's unique. You can't compensate something with something somebody else is also claiming, and you can't compensate for something if it's going to disappear in 5 years. It just doesn't make logical sense. So we've gone down a kind of our de facto based claims, if you like, are impact and compensatory impact, but those are quite technical languages. And so I think there needs to be something. If that explains what the instrument is, then what's the thing you'd stick on the product, or what's the thing you would talk about your company? And I think we need to give a range of options, as Kelly said, and I liked what Alyssa was saying earlier around Patagonia thinking authentically about their brand, because what actions in box 4 there work for one company, some will be quite conservative is the wrong word, but want something transactional. They don't want to have to think about it too hard. They just want to know its quality, and they're not going to get criticized for it, and they can say the right thing. Others might want to take more risk. They might want to do half of that, and then I'm going to invest in something that's a much higher hanging fruit that may or may not work. And it means I can't make this transactional claim, but I don't care. My company's got a more rebellious brand. Our history is in that space, or I want to do something a little different. And I think all of those options need to be open. I mean, to me, I always say to kind of people I'm mentoring, is like, well, box 4 is a place of added value and a place of inspiration and optimism. It doesn't necessarily mean there's no room for people that want to make transactional, simplistic claims. If that's how you access stuff, if a way to take action at scale is great, but it should be a place, having done the hard work around science-based abatement, this is a place where your company's character can really come through, I think, because, you can support things that are, if you're a travel company, you support, tourist destinations, for example. That's always been a trait of the carbon markets, but this kind of freeing away from a kind of one-to-one relationship with your residual emissions mean you could actually be quite, rebellious, for want of a better word, in what you choose to invest in, and maybe aim higher and not so worry about, necessarily that it is this kind of as many emission reductions or removals as your residual emissions. Actually, I'm going to do it because it's harder to reach, and that actually might end up being more impactful.
Great, thanks, Owen. And Pedro, I'm going to give you the last word here as we're drawing near to time. Or to
Thank you, Sarah. Very quickly, I noticed that the use of the word offsetting kind of upsets some people. So let me just say this. If you're using, to me, offset is just one potential use of a carbon credit. And I don't see anything particularly wrong in offsetting as a potential use. What I wouldn't want to see, and that is clear, is that it somehow goes upwards in the hierarchy of mitigation. And that's where I think initiatives like SBTI can actually really push companies to do their reductions internally. And then I wanted to also to kind of add a little bit one thing. There's sometimes this, and I've fallen to that kind of fallacy that is to say that, oh, if you're using a carbon credit, but you're not using it for offsetting purposes, then for instance, additionality or even permanence is not quite as relevant. And I'd push back a little bit because, again, we need additional emission reductions. We don't need emission reductions per se. That would have happened anyway. And we want companies to use their money effectively. So even in a situation, that's why box 4 here, I absolutely agree with it. And I agree that it's got reductions and it's got removals, as Brad mentioned, and it mentions credits. But I think the important thing here is that the idea that we have to be, or that we can allow ourselves to be a little bit relaxed about additionality, I push a little bit back against that, because again, that is about effectiveness of the use of climate finance and the resources, which are finite. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we want to leverage the strengths of the voluntary carbon market and make it fit for purpose in this new kind of more complex future. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for your attention, and in particular thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. We look forward to following up on a number of initiatives that were mentioned here, will be ongoing. So keep an eye out, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thanks a lot.